Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Made by McGill Alumni webcast, Facebook and Us, It's Complicated, where we take a deep look at recent allegations against Facebook and explore what they mean more broadly for our relationships with our favorite social media platforms. And as our title suggests, it's complicated. My name is Derek Cassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Wednesday, October 27th. I think it would be fair to say that October has not been a kind month for Facebook, the social media giant that counts more than 3 billion active users. Former employee turned whistleblower Frances Haugen appeared on 60 Minutes and then before the US Congress to reveal explosive testimony about how the company has knowingly put profits ahead of the well-being of its users. Facebook and its sister platforms, Instagram and WhatsApp, were also hit by an hours-long outage earlier this month that revealed how dependent many of us are on these platforms, sometimes relying on them as the sole means of running our businesses and organizations, let alone our social lives. Joining me today are two leading authorities on digital media and social networking platforms who are well placed to provide some interesting insight into how Facebook and other tools of the internet have polarized debate and sharpened divisions in our society. They will also weigh in on whether these recent allegations against Facebook might serve as the turning point needed to get governments focused on regulating the industry. Let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Taylor Owen, an associate professor at McGill's Max Bell School of Public Policy, the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications, and Director of McGill Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. He speaks and writes extensively about the digital media ecosystem through books, interviews, and opinion pieces, and is host of the Big Tech podcast. Welcome, Professor Owen.
Thanks for having me.
And we have with us Supriya Dwivedi, a noted media commentator on CBC's Power and Politics, and former morning radio host at Global News Radio in Toronto. She currently serves as Senior Counsel at Enterprise Canada, a leading public affairs and digital media firm. Supriya graduated from McGill with a bachelor's degree in science in 2008 before pursuing a law degree at l'Université de Montréal. Welcome, Supriya, and thank you for taking time to join us for what I think will be a fascinating discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Now, before we get started, just a reminder that if you're watching us live and have questions for our panelists, you can send them to us via email at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll do our best to address them to our guests. So, Professor Owen, maybe I'll start with you. Can you summarize for us these new allegations that were brought against Facebook by its former employee? And as someone who studied the company and its practices for many years, what surprised you most about what she revealed?
Sure. So I think first it's worth recognizing that there have been a number of previous whistleblowers over the past few years, or whistleblowers or people from within the company who have, for whatever reason, and I think there are lots of them, have taken it upon themselves to reveal things about the inside knowledge within these companies that they think the public should know. And Frances Haugen has done this in a number of ways. I mean, you mentioned the 60 Minutes appearance, but she's also filed a number of complaints with the SEC and provided literally thousands and thousands of pages of documentation that offer this window into what the company, how it operates, what it knows, how it discusses some of these issues we're gonna talk about today. So it's a fairly consequential sort of window into the mechanics of this company, which frankly operates a lot of the time like a bit of a black box to those of us on the outside. In terms of what she released and how our sort of knowledge has changed on this, I think there's a few important things that make this moment different and probably characterize this political and ultimately policy, I think, moment that we're in. One is she documented the internal knowledge of harm. People from the outside of these companies in civil society, in research institutions like my own, journalistic organizations and investigative journalists have for years been documenting with very sort of fragmented data these kinds of harms. And time again, the documentation of those harms has been denied by the company themselves. And now we know that they know of these harms because they hire, to their great credit, frankly, like other tech companies do not do this, but Facebook brings in academics to study this incredible trove of data that they have. And we now know that those internal studies, based on much better data than any of us on the outside had, were also documenting these same harms while they were being denied by the company themselves to governments, to the public. So that is an important piece of information. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of other just quick things I think that take this beyond previous revelations here. One is we now also know the extent to which their mitigation efforts of these harms have failed. So 80% of all resources that go to content moderation and disinformation go to American users, where 90% of the users of Facebook are in the rest of the world outside of the United States. So there's this huge disproportion of resources allocated to fixing these problems, these harms, and where they actually occur and where they are worse, which is more often than not in the global South. We know their AI only catches 3 to 5% of the total hate speech and incitement to violence that exists on the platform, a tiny fraction of what actually exists out there. So so there's a knowledge of harm, there's a failure in mitigating those harms. There's also a financial trade-off that's been revealed through these documents, which is between the incentives of the platform, which are towards user growth and user engagement, and the things they might do to further minimize harm. And we can now see that time and time again, the choice was made to maximize that engagement and that growth. And finally, and I think this is the real key here, is that Frances Haugen has focused policymakers in a very strategic way on some things that I think can make a fundamental difference here, on how you create more transparency in the system. So how we from the outside can see all these things that we now have a better window into, and how we can hold these institutions more accountable. We've been too distracted, I think, in the policy world on sort of playing whack-a-mole with bad things, with hate speech, with individual toxic content, with the individual interference moments, and not looking at the structure. And she's focusing on the structure. So I hope that for that package of things, I think we're now finally having the right conversations.
Wow, wonderful. I think you've answered all of my questions, Professor Owen. So thanks
Perfect.
for that. So we can go now. No, thank you. That's actually a really interesting, a good opening to sort of explain. We'll get into in some detail exactly what some of her allegations were and how they're affecting the practices that sort of govern Facebook's operations. But let me turn to Supriya. I think you mentioned, Professor Owen, that a lot of these allegations that were brought up by Frances Haugen recently we've known about them for many years. Researchers like Professor Owen, investigative journalists have written books about them and articles. But this time it sort of feels different for some reason. It's the first time we're devoting a webcast for McGill alumni on the topic, for one. So I guess my question to you, Supriya, is, first of all, do we have any idea how Facebook's executives are reacting to these charges? And are we right to think that this time around, the company's going to have a harder time just shrugging it off and moving on?
Yeah, so I think with respect to everything that's been laid out by Professor Owen, I think it's very clear that this moment is somewhat different, just given the breadth, I think, of the problem is now very hard to ignore. And the fact that internally Facebook themselves were at least aware of it, and were also aware that their mitigation efforts weren't near the degree to which that they needed to be. I think with respect to whether or not they'll have a harder time shaking off these allegations, I think that's likely true simply because we've reached a bit of a impatient sort of tipping point with Facebook, right? Where it's like the first time around we would have heard allegations from whistleblowers or those that were formerly employed by the company, some years ago. It's like, okay, but now there's a clear pattern. And I think the more pessimistic side of myself, which I will admit is more than half, will just say that I don't necessarily have a ton of faith in the top brass at Facebook really taking to heart some of what has been revealed and it instilling this sort of sea change within the company to, either implement the changes needed or to properly engage with policymakers and with legislators to try and solve the problem. Because, there's, we mentioned a bit of this being a pattern, but the pattern in which the Facebook executives and top brass react has also been well established, where, something will happen. It will be, bad headlines. Their stock may take a bit of a hit, but then rebound eventually. There'll be leaks in terms of the internal message boards and, internal memos that are going around, blaming the negative headlines and the negative press on like outside agitators who don't understand the company. And, sooner or later, either the media sort of gets tired of it, or the public kind of is like, meh, and there isn't really any real change, at least from within the company. So I agree that it's different, but I don't know if it's different enough to actually spark any sort of change within Facebook.
Interesting. And Professor Owen, do you agree? I mean, could this be a turning point for Facebook, or are they merely to just sort of, again, shrug it off, move on?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think part of the problem is we time and time again keep expecting one of the largest publicly traded companies in the world to change itself. And I'm just not sure that should be the expectation. I think when we as a society and democratic citizens in a democratic society see harms that we don't think are being properly addressed by private actors, that's when we have a responsibility to act, either to change our behavior or to demand that our governments regulate against some of these risks. So I think this constant focus on how Facebook is changing and reacting is kind of putting too much onus on them to fix a problem that their very business model created. That being said, it is very possible that, Facebook may announce tomorrow that they are renaming themselves. They may announce that this shift to some of their other products, aside from Facebook, is going to be their strategic focus. Things like augmented and virtual reality. And part of that shift is a response to this kind of discussion we're having. So, yes, they are changing, but that I don't think we should place all the onus on them to fix this problem.
Right. And we will hopefully have time. We'll get to some questions about how we go about fixing it and what role is there for government to play? Yeah. What role can we as private citizens play? So let me just stick with you, Professor Owen, for a minute. For those, for the sake of those, maybe, uninitiated or not familiar with how Facebook works, a lot of the discussion that Frances Haugen brought up, a lot of her allegations, centered around Facebook's algorithms. So can you explain to us sort of how these algorithms work and what role they play in determining what information Facebook users see in their news feeds, and how this is really at the root of a lot of the problems?
Sure. So when you open up your Facebook account, you see a feed of content, and there are thousands or tens of thousands of pieces of content that you could be shown, but because of the scale of that content and the individual preferences of each of the 2.7 billion users of Facebook, Facebook, like other platform companies, use an algorithm to decide or determine what information we are shown. And that makes a lot of sense in many ways. The challenge is that algorithm can be calibrated for all sorts of different things. For example, it could be calibrated in theory for reliable information or journalism from reputable journalism sources. So when we open it up, we might see content from that kind of content. But it can also be calibrated for the things that make us read more and scroll more, or the things that give us an emotional response, things that make us angry, things that engage us, is the term that's used. And it turns out that that is a constant calibration that all of these companies make, and they can play with that calibration. So one story that's come out of the Haugen documents is that for a time, Facebook ranked in that algorithm the angry emoji 5 times higher than the like emoji. And what they saw is that kept people engaged for longer, because people engage with and consume things that make them angry. But are the things that make us angry necessarily correlated with the things that are good for a democratic society? And I don't know if we know that. Sometimes it is, right? When I see a story about a Me Too allegation, I get angry. It's probably good for society that I'm angry about that. But that's not always the case. And so we're seeing that this calibration is something that, again, deserves more transparency and scrutiny from the public that uses the tools that those algorithms determine.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, so from what I understand, and the research is showing that Facebook's own research is showing that when users are on the site and they're angry and upset and emotional, it may be harmful to them and their disposition around the world and create these divisions, but it actually keeps them on the site longer, and therefore these algorithms work as far as Facebook is concerned.
It may, and work is the operative word there. I mean, who is defining what works? Is it the financial incentives of a private organization? Is it the democratic interests of a democratic society? Is it the choice of an individual user? I mean, everybody might have a different definition of how that should work, right. But it's all done behind this sort of veil of privacy and secrecy, so we don't know. And we now know that they test different things, and at times they tweak these algorithms that in ways that I would argue benefit democratic societies, and sometimes they do in ways that I would argue harm it. But we don't know, and it's their choice. And the question is, should it be their choice? Right. And I'm not entirely sure it should. Mm-hmm.
So let me bring Supriya in on that point. So maybe I'll just play devil's advocate for a moment. I mean, are we giving the design of these algorithms too much credit in terms of how they shape people's understanding of issues and their perspectives on the world? I mean, can we not just trust users as they sift through the content to figure out what's truth, what's a lie, what's right, what's wrong? Or am I perhaps giving humans too much credit to be able to do that?
I mean, I don't think you're giving humans or the human mind too much credit as much as maybe perhaps downplaying the pervasiveness of the algorithm and just how powerful a tool it can be, because it can seriously start to warp your sense of reality. And I'll just give one anecdotal example with a sample size of one being myself. I quit Facebook shortly after my daughter was born. She was a newborn. I was, being inundated with a lot of new mom stuff, like, mom groups here, how to breastfeeding tips here, what have you. Whatever my engagement on Facebook was, started to promote a lot of like wellness content that was like Gwyneth Paltrow goop adjacent, which then slowly within days started to morph into anti-vax content. And for myself, I looked at that and was like, okay, well, this is very weird. And it is something that I'm not interested in. I have a science degree from the best university in the world. So, I had that sort of background. But if I was a little bit more hesitant in my own beliefs, if I was a little bit more unsure about, the safety, the efficacy, and the science behind vaccines generally, then I could have gone down a very different path. And I think that is what is at the heart of all of this, is that it's not simply choosing what you engage with, but it's with your entire network. So if somebody that is engaging in something and you've liked one of their posts, then all of a sudden, the algorithm might start to push that content into your feed. And before you know it, you're down this like really weird rabbit hole of very hyper specific content. And to Taylor's point, I think that is what at the heart of this really is the accountability and the transparency behind this, is that they, are hiding behind what they're claiming to be very proprietary knowledge or software. But when it's impacting all of us in this way, I think citizens or users, whatever you want to call us in the Facebook context, have a right to know. And so I think in the larger scale, if you're talking about, less about, me and my new mom travails and more about the context of democracy in general, it's very easy to see how a regular person that may not be following the minutia of the news cycle, who may not be a paid subscriber to, mainstream journalistic outlets or other trusted verified sources, can really easily find themselves in a situation where they're being inundated with either, disinformation or misinformation from other folks on their own feeds. And then they end up, believing these very demonstrably false, but still equally harmful conspiracy theories like Pizzagate in the US, right? And so I guess the heart of what I'm saying is the problem with these algorithms is that they're basically force feeding you your weaknesses that play on your own worst biases and impulses. And in some cases, it'll turn out to be okay. But in others, you have a guy with a gun showing up at a pizza parlor because he's trying to save children from, Hillary Clinton and her cabal of Democratic elites.
Right. Can I just build on that for 1 second? Because I think, that personal anecdote is incredibly powerful and I think reflective of a broader problem. Part of the challenge those of us who sit outside of this company have faced is we're constantly experiencing these personal anecdotes or hearing these individual cases, but it's very difficult to get a window into the collective behavior that occurs on these platforms. So there's a lot of reporting, for example, that describes that very phenomena of new moms being targeted with increasingly more anti-vax related content. There is also a lot of public accounts of people who express an affinity with Trump getting more and more pushed into the QAnon groups and more radical and more violent white nationalist content. So we can see these in a way from the outside. And there's a lot of good reporting and sort of more anthropological almost studies of that phenomena. But what we now see is that people who have all the data internally have also studied these phenomena and confirmed them. And that's very powerful. Because we now know that intuition that's based on this experience we all have with these tools is actually in many cases right. And the decisions, unfortunately, have been made at various moments to not minimize those harms, but instead keep that engine of engagement and revenue going. And that's where the problem is here.
Right. Now, and I imagine that COVID has probably made this much worse and exacerbated the issue. So let me go back to you, Supriya. I think I heard you speak earlier on a different webcast. You were actually sharing a story about rumors circulating about effective medicines for, I think was it cow's urine, if I'm not mistaken? Maybe you can share that, because I think that's a great example of how, misinformation can start to circulate in the community and sort of really become fact at some point, right?
Yeah. So the story I was telling on that webcast was there was, a few international media reports that were reporting on a very slim minority of Hindu preachers that were advocating for cow urine as a way to help, ward off COVID, and that drinking cow urine was the way to go. There are a few, AP reports here, a Reuters report here, and that was it. The story sort of died off. And I had read it because I'm a news junkie and I keep up to date on this sort of thing. A few weeks, passed by, and I started getting questions from my mother-in-law, who, has been in Canada since the 70s, but is still very connected to India and, consumes a lot of news and what have you, through these WhatsApp forwards that she was getting, promoting this as this big cure that like big pharma was basically trying to keep down because they didn't want you to know about this. And it ended up turning out, once I did a little bit of digging and I was talking to her and a few of her friends about this, was that there was a talk radio program here in the GTA that had actually interviewed a proponent of said cow urine, cure of COVID. And that's where they had heard it. And that's where the community here really started to talk about this. And so it just really goes to show how we're all really connected in the most cliche of ways, but also in the most dangerous of ways too, where something that starts off, halfway around the globe ends up impacting the community here. And I'm not suggesting that people in droves were taking shots of cow urine or anything like that. But, just the fact that it ended up being, first of all, talked about on GTA airwaves here, but also just that you had, reasonable, educated people that were asking about this, I think goes to show about the pervasiveness of this all.
Right. Can I just to build again on that, like really astute point here, that a lot of these problems, we end up focusing on their impact on us in sort of Western democracies. Yeah. But this problem, and this has has been identified by researchers and journalists and citizens in other parts of the world to largely deaf ears in our country, in the global West, that these problems are magnified radically in those other countries. And that is in part because of the lack of resources that are put in place in moderating the content in those countries. And so India is a great example. We now know from these documents that there were warning bells going off inside Facebook about the incitement to violence occurring in various Hindu nationalist movements inside Facebook. And yet Facebook had only 5 of the largest 22 languages spoken on Facebook in India being moderated. So how do we square this circle, right, of this huge problem that's leading to violence in countries around the world, and very little attention being paid to it by the companies that we sort of empower to decide what can be said and can't be said. So it really is a problem.
But just to stick to that point, Professor Owen, I mean, when Facebook first came out and sort of, reached initially the masses, wasn't this supposed to be, the whole point was to give people a voice? So I didn't have to rely on, say, call it the traditional news media, like people that didn't have that opportunity to sort of say what they wanted to say now have this opportunity. Anyone can go on Facebook, I guess. So that's an opportunity that I guess has been turned on its head, if I understand correctly.
Well, I mean, there is no doubt that there are tremendous benefits to individuals that were once left out of our public conversations getting voice, and perhaps more importantly, being able to act collectively in ways that are self-mobilized. I mean, that is an incredibly powerful thing. But the benefits of it do not necessarily mean that we have to ignore all the ways that empowerment can be abused. And I think focusing on this, the way information circulates, the way information is amplified, it gets at the sort of root cause of some of that problem, which is not just individual acts of toxic speech or hateful speech or incitement to violence. It's the fact that content can now circulate in a way that is disproportionate to its audience and to reach new audience. And that's the real problem here. And you pair that with a lack of attention and a lack of responsibility by many of these companies for weeding out that particularly bad content and for changing that incentive structure that might minimize its reach. And you get a different kind of problem than we've had before.
Great. So I have a follow-up question for you on that, Supriya, but just a reminder, anyone watching live, if you have any questions for Supriya or Professor Owen, you can send them to us at aoc@mcgill.ca. So just building on that point, Supriya, about sort of, I guess there's this whole notion of like freedom of speech, and now this new idea of freedom of reach. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I guess, freedom of speech is something that we would all defend, but Facebook or these social media companies are now taking it to another level by enabling anybody to have this new freedom of reach. So what do we need to be thinking about there?
So that's an interesting question. In the early days of Facebook or social media, I think a lot of the comparisons that we heard was that Facebook, or insert whatever social media platform here, was the new town square, right? And so it's no different than just going to a town square and like holding up a sandwich board or, holding up a microphone and saying whatever you want. But that's not really accurate, because in the town square example, the people would have to actually physically show up. And for the Facebook analogy or social media analogy of the town square to be true, you would only be really seeing content that you were actively following or engaging with. And that's not what we're seeing, right? And that's not what happens. What happens is that Facebook and some of these other, social media platforms via their algorithms will push content onto your feeds dependent on what, they deem you to be interested in, based on what a friend of a friend might be doing, based on some sort of overlapping content between one group that you're a member of and another group that you're not a member of. And all of a sudden you're pushed with that sort of content. I mean, in the earlier example that I gave about the anti-vax content when I was a new mom, I mean, you know, I can tell you right off the bat, I wasn't engaging with any of that, and yet it still showed up in my feed. And so I think in the hate speech context, we have to be very careful about, you know, talking about this solely within the silo of being free speech. Yes, free speech is obviously incredibly important. And like, you know, we're never going to be able to regulate the entirety of the internet, nor should we. And we should be very wary of governments who speak in these absolute kind of terms. But I think we also have to be very cognizant of the harms created, particularly in, you know, countries, as Taylor has rightly pointed out, countries like India, countries like Myanmar, where we've seen actual violence be the direct cause of some of this hate speech going unchecked. And I think we're going down a very dangerous path.
We also, in these conversations, tend to think of free speech as a common thing. And it's not. Democratic societies and certainly illiberal societies define free speech differently. In Germany, Nazi hate speech is illegal. In the United States, it is not. Those are two very different definitions of free speech that those societies have developed over time. In Canada, our charter balances the right to free speech against a competing right, which is the right to not be harmed by speech. And that's something we've developed on our own. Now we're in a scenario where a technology or a set of incentives by private actors is essentially overriding the free speech norms and regulations and laws that we've developed on our own as democratic societies. We might be willing to do that. I mean, I think there are benefits to that definition of free speech that we might want to adopt in our societies. And if I live in an illiberal regime, I might prefer that definition, the Silicon Valley American definition of free speech, than the one my regime is enforcing on me. But these are different in every national context. So free speech means many things to many people. There's not like a global Facebook or YouTube or Twitter definition of free speech that the entire world should be expected to adopt.
So as I'm listening to the two of you discuss this company that has created a very addictive product, one that is now being deemed to be harmful, and the company themselves internally, I guess, are recognizing that it's harmful but addictive and keeps people coming back, and I guess more eyeballs, more ad revenue, more profit. I can't help but think about another analogy, which is the tobacco industry. So Professor Owen, I guess my question to you is that analogy fair? Is this a similar situation like what, you know, governments and society dealt with, you know, when trying to rein in tobacco companies?
I mean, the only way the analogy holds is that there might have been knowledge of harm internally to these companies, internal knowledge of harm based on internal research that conflicted their public's denials of that harm, right? And that right. Certainly happened with the tobacco industry, and it looks like in some cases it happened here too. But I think that's ultimately where the analogy breaks down. This is a much more complicated problem than banning cigarettes. There is no broad social good to smoking cigarettes. Cigarettes are not embedded in our democratic societies. They do not empower people who are otherwise disempowered in our society. They are not integral to our democracy. These platforms are. And so regulating them is much, much more difficult than just saying cigarettes cause cancer and are bad. So I think it goes, we're always, part of the challenge here, and this gets to the policy conversation, is we're always grasping for metaphors for what these things are. They're like public health, they're like pharmaceutical industry, they're like seatbelts, they're like all but the reason we do that is because we have regulated and figured out how to regulate those things in the past. So we think they provide a roadmap to now. And in some cases they do. I mean, I think there's some things we can learn from these past kind of controversial regulatory efforts. But the reality is these platforms are something fundamentally new. And in order to get this sort of balance of regulation and new laws right, we need to treat them for what they are, not for what we might want to think they look like.
Right.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, I mean, I agree with a lot of what the Professor Owen had to say, and I would just add to that the difference also lies in the fact that big tobacco has been regulated quite extensively for basically my entire life, if not at least the vast majority of my entire life, right? There are very stringent labeling and advertising restrictions when it comes to dissuading younger folks from taking up smoking to begin with. There's a lot of labeling, right? Like basically my entire life, you could not go and buy a pack of cigarettes without there being a stringent warning label. Like imagine if you, every time you logged into Facebook, it said, warning, this is bad for your health, or this is bad for your brain. Like it would be a very different situation. So in a lot of ways, I think what we're dealing with Facebook now is on several levels worse than the way we've had to deal with other, industries like big tobacco.
Yeah. I mean, the one place, building on that, the one place that the metaphors make sense, I think, is in stressing the point that we have regulated in very intrusive ways other big, complicated industries, and often global companies. I mean, you think of just the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, we put incredible onus on the development on private companies on the development of drugs, for example, that are highly intrusive and demand an incredible amount of transparency, of forced transparency. We do it for the banking sector too. We do it. So I think as the idea that we have and can regulate big, complicated global companies is an important one to hold on to. These things are not ungovernable. And in fact, the idea that they are ungovernable plays into their ultimate interest here, which is to remain ungoverned. So
right. So you're suggesting that the clinical trials for COVID vaccines, for instance, were highly, highly regulated? Because I read on Facebook they weren't, but no, we won't go there. Just a reminder again, if you're watching live, you have questions, it's aoc@mcgill.ca. Let me turn our attention now. It's a great opportunity to talk about regulation. Or I guess the broader question, maybe I'll start with you, Supriya, is, okay, great. We know there's an issue. We know there's a problem. We know other industries have been regulated. What can governments do in this case? I mean, where do they start? We're talking about big international tech giants.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And if I'm being completely honest right now, I don't know if in Canada we've really struck a right chord or a right tone in terms of how to go about having the beginnings of these conversations to begin with. I think in terms of what governments tend to focus on, they tend to focus on the actual hate speech in and of itself, or the actual incitement to violence. And I think what they should be focusing on, or at least most of their focus should be on, the transparency and the accountability within the organization itself. So how does their algorithm actually work? How is it, forcing content onto people's feeds? How does it impact people's moods? How does it impact, younger folks in terms of their propensity to engage in either harmful behavior or exhibit more feelings of anxiety, depression, eating disorders, et cetera. So I think that's where the focus should be on. But instead, we end up in this really weird sort of roundabout conversation of these absolutist sort of terms of banning, certain phrases, statements, or policing speech. And it's very easy, if you have any libertarian side to you whatsoever, if you value the nature of, unimpeded discourse amongst fellow responsible citizens, that you're going to argue against that, because and that's where I think the mistake in Canada has largely been made.
Mm-hmm. Professor Owen?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I think there's a reason that people focus on the speech outcome of these systems, and it's because it's the thing we all see. It's when we log on and we see something horrible, or we open a newspaper and a journalist has flagged something horrible, or if I'm a politician who are ultimately kind of responsible for this governance agenda, I am exposed to a tremendous amount of horrible content and abuse. And so it's that thing we feel viscerally, and we know we dislike about these technologies. So the impetus there is to then regulate that. or to stop that. And like Supriya said, they're the symptom of the problem, not the cause. And it could be that addressing the root cause solves a lot of that toxic content problem that we see viscerally, or at least we'll know if it does. And then if we fix those structural things, or if we address some of those incentives, we will know the actual nature of the hate speech problem, and we can address that after. Because it's the hardest one to regulate, because free speech government's control of speech is a very complicated topic that we've debated for 100 years in our country. Doing that first is maybe not the best place to start.
Yeah, and I would just add to that lastly, in terms of, it's just a very easy and lazy place for a politician to go as well, right? I mean, everybody's against hate speech. Nobody's going to be like, I'm actually for hate speech and the incitement for violence. So it's just a really easy way for them to stake a position on, send a letter out to their constituents and like clamor for donations.
Yeah, which is why when I think our government, to get to the Canadian conversation, was probably overconfident in the public support for this piece of legislation, these pieces of legislation. Because if you ask Canadians, do you want government to do something about hate speech? Like overwhelmingly, they say yes. I mean, why would you not want it? But then if you drill into that and say, do you want governments making decisions on gray area speech decisions between possibly hate speech and possibly harmful speech? And that's a much trickier problem that doesn't have the same degree of support in the public, I think.
Right. And from a government perspective, Professor Owen, I guess when you're looking at it from the Canadian landscape, it's even that much more complicated, because these companies they're not based in Canada, they're headquartered elsewhere. I mean, I'm imagining the US Congress, which seems to have some bipartisan support now around cracking down or doing something. I guess once you get to smaller countries, it's even less influence that they can have, right?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I kind of bristle at that question because you get it a lot. I mean, we have sovereignty. We're a country. Right. We're allowed to impose our own laws on any business of any kind that wants to operate in our jurisdiction. And we do it all the time, right? We don't change our seatbelt laws because some international company might not want to have the same kind of auto safety standards we put in place. Like that, if a pharmaceutical company wants to develop a drug in Canada, we don't trust the FDA. We do our own. We have our own approval process.
But I guess the difference is those are tangible products that have to come into the border, and we could turn them away from the border, right? This is
yes. I mean, to a certain degree. I mean, the idea that these are all entirely intangible products, therefore kind of slippery and out of our jurisdiction, in some cases is true. But like, for example, if you want to sell an ad in Canada, you should probably have to abide by Canadian advertising standards. That is a tangible product, a service that is sold in our jurisdiction. So we have clear jurisdiction over that kind of thing. But the reality is clearly the case that certain markets have enough size and consequence and weight that when they make regulatory change, it probably affects everybody in the world. And the US is certainly one of them. I mean, California is actually in its own itself probably one of them, but so is the EU. And so I think there's also sort of potential alignment that we could make with other like-minded jurisdictions in order to participate in that regulation in a way that can create market incentive for these companies to change. So there's some strategy there for sure.
And just to touch on that a little bit, I mean, in the Canadian context as well, we do tend to have a different set of rules for, advertising to children, for example. It's different in the rest of Canada than it is in Quebec. It's much more stringent in Quebec as per the Code Civil. If we're talking about, I'm in the GTA now, but having grown up in the townships and then in Montreal, like Shoppers Drug Mart is not called Shoppers Drug Mart in Quebec. It's called Pharmafree, right? So there are other differences that we accept in a Canadian context that I think we should probably be a little bit more, willing to do in this context as well.
Yeah, I would note that there isn't a lot of questioning of whether Quebec, whether they have jurisdiction over these companies or not. That is an accepted power.
There's a whole other webcast right there. Yeah. So Supriya, if governments are kind of working through this and struggling through it, in the meantime, is there any role for private citizens to play? You guys both talked about sort of the market. Let the market. I mean, we are the market. We are the users. Is there anything we as users can do short of leaving these platforms? Or is that what it's going to take? Is it just going to have to be that people will just get fed up walk away in large enough numbers that the companies themselves will either have to change their practices or go bust.
I mean, it's either that or advertisers, right? So it's either that it's like it has to impact their bottom line or their wallets at some point, or in this case, their share price, right? So anything that is going to, I think, be inherent to Facebook for them to change is going to have to impact them in a way that'll make them want to change. So maybe that's users leaving in droves. Maybe that's advertisers thinking twice. About using their platform, but I may be not the best person to ask because I did leave Facebook. I mean, I didn't leave the ecosystem because I still have WhatsApp on my phone. And I mean, I use Instagram, not super regularly, but it's still there. But to really, make a point, I think it's a lot easier said than done to say to leave a platform. I mean, I did so when I was still a journalist, but I wasn't a reporter, I wasn't a producer, I was a host, so I didn't have to chase down guests. I wasn't looking for story ideas regularly.
But you bet your producers did, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. Yeah. But if I was a producer, I would have to do that. When I started off my career at CJD, as a fill-in host, I chased a lot of my own content. And so there's no way I would have been able to walk away from Facebook then. So there is a very specific segment, I think, of the population that can very easily walk away from it. But, that comes from, I guess, a little bit of privilege as well to be able to do that.
Yeah. Right. And there's something also to the reality that these tools are embedded in our lives in some really important ways. I mean, my son's school, elementary school, uses Facebook to communicate with parents. I mean, the cost to stepping away from that is real, and I make that choice, but it's a significant cost that I don't think we should necessarily demand everybody make, because these in some ways have become sort of utilities. But I mean, we did which won that point. I'm part of this Commission on Democratic Expression. And one of the things we do is we run a citizens assembly every year where there's between 40 and 50 randomly selected Canadians who spend 6 months looking at sort of this topic. And one of the striking things is that the more people learn, and I think this is true of our societies in general right now, the more they learn about the problem, the more they see the need for collective solutions. That it's not just on them, right? It's not their fault that their kid likes YouTube and is addicted to it. It's not their fault that there's this radicalization happening on Facebook and they're getting sucked into some of that. In some cases, there's some individual agency, but these are collective problems. And when we have collective problems, that's when we look, in some cases, for governments to protect us against these harms. So the more people learn about this, the more they ultimately support that kind of government approach to this. So I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah. So when you talked about comparing Facebook or social media to a utility, that's interesting because I know earlier this month there was also the infamous now infamous outage. So for several hours, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, the whole family of apps kind of went down around the world. And I think that really underscored for many people how dependent we all are on these apps, and not just for socializing, but I mean, there are restaurants that don't have websites anymore. They just have menus and their business information on Facebook. I read, I think it was in the New York Times, there was a women's shelter in Colombia, South America, where they deal with domestic abuse, and they basically rely on Facebook and WhatsApp for women to be able to report emergencies, and they basically were out of commission. So, I mean, I guess the question is, we have to think about that. What kind of, as we demand more scrutiny of these companies and more regulations, I guess it's scary to think that we are so dependent on many of these platforms, much like we are on electricity and running water. So how do we deal with that?
Hillary's asking you, I think, how to solve all of our society's ills. That's on you, man.
All right. Look, I mean, for one, it stresses how that global issue we've been talking about. I mean, WhatsApp going down in countries in the global south is a very, very serious thing. It is in many countries the primary mode of communication, not just for businesses, but for society at large. So when we talk about how these companies operate and how their design decisions affect societies, we need to really zero in on where that harm can be. But look, the fact that they are embedded in our lives, they become in some ways like utilities, just further increases the need to ensure that their design and their operation and their maintenance and their moderation is subject to some sort of oversight. I mean, that's basically all we're asking for here, all I'm asking for here. Some basic measures of accountability and transparency that will ensure that the decisions being made on how these tools are designed and maintained are being done so in a way that sort of is aligned with our societal interests. I mean, the demand isn't that significant ultimately.
Right. Even if these companies end up making a little bit less profit as a result of these measures.
Well, these are some of the most profitable companies in history. I mean, right. Facebook's revenue was over $80 billion last year, and they like to say that they spent $5 billion on content moderation. 90% of that was spent in the United States. So should the profit margins be slightly less in order to address the scale of the problem or the nature of these harms? I mean, I think the case is pretty clear that that's something we as citizens and users would be okay with. Our shareholders are the banks that we invest in that fund that are investors in these products feel the same way. I think we also know they don't. And that's been part of the problem here.
Right. Yeah. And I think, if we were in a purely dystopian sort of capitalist hellscape, then and then, maybe we shouldn't necessarily be reining in profits of any sort. But I'd like to think we're not really in that dystopian capitalist hellscape just yet. And we're still, advocating for responsibility, whether on a corporate level or just among citizens. So I think there's a big argument for oversight, for, regulatory oversight, but also to Taylor's point, and he made this point quite well, along with a couple of co-authors in the Globe and Mail recently, but just like transparency, right? Like, I think this is what is at the heart of all of this, is accountability and transparency.
Right. Well, I'm just glad we managed to reference both cow urine and dystopian hellscape on the same webcast. So
look at the petrochem, like I think acknowledging that I think metaphors have their limits. Let me give you a metaphor. But the petrochemical industry in the southern United States, right, was had some of the biggest profit margins of any industry in the US economy. But in part because it flushed its pollutants into lakes and rivers without any regulation whatsoever. And that was seen as having a social cost, or an environmental cost, and a human cost, and a social cost. So they were regulated. Now, they were regulated and not banned because petrochemicals are used for all sorts of purposes we think are valuable to society. It doesn't mean we should also accept the harms that industry caused. What happened? The industry cleaned up. The industry continued to make all these products that we use, and their profit margins went down slightly. So we do this. We've done this before.
Right. So we did receive a question. Let me turn to that. We have a few minutes left. This question did come to us from Peter Bogue, who's an emeritus professor of biology down the road at Queen's University, or up the road in your case, Supriya. So his question is, are there alternatives to Facebook which operate as either open source or nonprofit platforms? Or within the private sector, are there platforms that have more transparency and are less devious and less invasive business models? Professor Owen, are there, or are they all really, we're talking about Facebook, are they all really sort of in the same category?
So look, all these companies operate differently and have different policies. And I think in many ways, Facebook takes more internal responsibility for these harms than some of the other platforms. And we need to recognize and appreciate and acknowledge that. But there's a couple of challenges to the competition piece of this. One is a collective action problem, which is once you have a scale of 2.7 billion users, it's very difficult for a competitor to kind of emerge that can supplant that. There's just this network effect that occurs when you become that sort of instrumental to a communication system. So that's one element of it. The other is that I would argue we don't have a functioning market. That because of certain anti-competitive behaviors of these companies, and that's a whole other conversation, the market isn't able to produce competitors in a way it should in an efficiently run market. And so that's part of the reason I don't think we have the kind of competitors that we might want, so that we could make those choices as consumers to choose another product that might offer a different value proposition or a different incentive structure. In some ways, we have some market failure here that need to be addressed, not through hate speech or data privacy, but actually through competition policy. And that's why you're seeing that real move in the US to antitrust and various forms of competition measures.
Right. And I guess so far the business practices have been to buy up your competitors. So Facebook sees that its photo sharing isn't going so well. Look at this Instagram app. We'll just buy that for $1 billion. And Google steps in and buys YouTube, and you sort of end up with these, mega Walmart, Amazon type companies dominating the landscape. So, okay. Well, listen, we only have a few minutes left. So maybe if we have time for one last question, maybe I'll ask each of you for sort of, a prediction of sorts, if you don't mind. So I guess my question to you, I'll start with you, Professor Owen, and then I'll put the same question to you, Supriya. So looking back at this conversation and everything that's happened in the last month, do you in fact think that this will turn out to have been the turning point in our relationship with Facebook and how governments are involved and regulate these social media giants? And is this now the beginning of a path to reform or recovery or not? Professor Owen, maybe in 30 seconds.
I think the turning point has probably already occurred. I think societies are very aware of these problems now in a way they weren't 5 years ago. This latest month of flurry of activity probably adds to that sense, and perhaps adds to the mandate that governments think they have to act here. But no, I think we've already had that turning point, frankly. We know the harms. Those harms have now been acknowledged in ways we may not have expected. And we're heading down to a path of how we will regulate and govern, not whether we will.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, with the only caveat being that I'm not sure that internally they've reached any sort of turning point. I think the turning point is because of pressure they're feeling from the outside. It's all been external thus far, and they've been, largely dealing with this internally as solely being a PR problem for them, and not actually being a, more abstract or esoteric problem in terms of how they're harming democracy itself, right? And I think until that happens, they're gonna have governments, thrust upon them regulations or oversight, and it won't necessarily be coming from within.
Wow. Well, this is really, really fascinating. I have enough questions to probably get us through another hour or so of conversation, but I do notice that we're just about at the top of the hour. So we are going to have to close the conversation and wrap it up here. Thank you both. Before we close, though, I would like to remind everyone watching that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. I would, of course, like to extend my deepest gratitude to our two guests today, Professor Taylor Owen and McGill graduate Supriya Dwivedi, for joining me today and sharing such profound and thoughtful insight. It is indeed a complicated challenge facing our society, and I appreciate you both taking the time to help us unpack some of the issues and offer a few suggestions on a way forward. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in, and please keep an eye out on your McGill email and, dare I say, social media feeds for more updates about our online programming. Until then, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Good to see you, Supriya.